Great.
It's roughly balanced across those three groups, academics, students, and then other.
That's great.
Welcome, everybody. We'll give another 30 seconds or so for the waiting room for people to file in from the virtual waiting room into this virtual workshop. All right, I'll begin. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to be hosting today instead of Joanna. So I'm glad to see everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. I'm so glad you could join us. This is our first workshop of 2025 for our CCA workshop. Hopefully you've all had a chance to see the calendar, mark your own calendars to be sure to attend these bi-weekly workshops. And we're lucky enough this week to start off with Leah Reisman, who's going to be talking with us today about her new book and all these really good insights that I'm excited to do. And as per usual, we don't belabor introductions and big backgrounds, and I'm not going to read her CV for you. You're going to be you have a computer at your fingertips. You can dig in more if you still need to. But I want to jump right into it and turn the microphone over to Leah and let her guide us through this talk. And then the second half, we'll have a lot of good interactive Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug, and thanks so much to the Center for the introduction. So I'm going to share some slides that I'll talk through, and then we'll get going. Play from the start. All right, can everybody see that? Awesome. So as Doug mentioned, I'm really happy to be here today talking a little bit about my book on consulting in the nonprofit sector. So this project was adapted from my doctoral dissertation in sociology at Princeton, which I finished in 2020. The book's title is How Consultants Shape Nonprofits, Shared Values, Unintended Consequences. It was released in the fall. I think the pub date was actually Election Day, which was interesting, via Stanford Press and the SSIR book series. And just two quick notes before I get started. One, I'm just getting over the flu. So if I have a coughing episode during this talk, I'll just momentarily go off audio and then I'll come back. So don't worry, I'll come back. And just to say, now I wear a couple of different hats. I no longer am in academia. I have a courtesy appointment at NYU, but I spend most of my time in the nonprofit sector. I work at a foundation in Philadelphia and sit on the boards of several organizations. And so as such, this book is kind of meant to be facing a dual audience, both of scholars and also practitioners, consultants, philanthropic practitioners, nonprofit leaders in the field. So hopefully you'll see that in the tone of what I share, and I'm always curious and interested in feedback. So we'll talk through like what I'll be doing today. So I'll share a little bit about the context for the book, like why study consultants, why do we care? A little bit about the field itself, talk you through my core argument as well as some of the implications for the field. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions. And just so you all know, this book is not specific to the arts field, though a lot of my prior research focused on arts organizations and my professional background is also in the arts and culture. So I won't talk a lot in this conversation about arts and cultural organizations specifically, but I did include an explicit focus. I included arts organizations heavily in the research for this book. The story I'll tell is definitely germane to the arts, and I'm happy to answer further questions or talk more about that, the arts case in the Q&A. So first I'll share a little bit of context for the book. really rooted in the question of like, why do consultants matter? Why should we study consultants? So first of all, as those of you who are practitioners in the field probably know, consultants are pretty ubiquitous in the nonprofit sector. There's not very good research about the extent of consultant use, partially because it's really hard to define like who is a consultant. But in 2017, management consulting writ large, which includes corporate consulting, was an industry valued at more than $250 billion. And in 2015, the Foundation Center, now Candid, did a study that showed that 1 in 3 foundations had used consultants in the prior 2 years. So it's a pretty, heavily used service in the nonprofit sector. And then second, as I talk about in the book, via their work, consultants intervene in both pressing and perennial issues in the nonprofit sector. And I'll just name a few of those issues. Things like the role of data and evaluation in nonprofit work, nonprofits' relationships with their communities, funding and revenue models to sustain nonprofits, and how nonprofits are and should be compared to nonprofit organizations. So although they're kind of like positioned at a particular place in the sector, they're touching a lot of the issues that we talk about when we talk about the nonprofit sector today. So this book specifically focuses on management consulting in the nonprofit sector. So just to share a little bit about how I personally got interested in consultants. So before I went to grad school, I was working in a museum, and my organization hired some consultants to guide them through a strategic planning process. And the consultants did a lot of work with lots of spreadsheets and interviews and meetings, and then gave the museum several recommendations. And I saw how consultants could have a really large influence on their clients, but I didn't understand what they actually did. And so that curiosity drove the research that underpins this book. So if we take a general definition of management consulting and apply it to nonprofits, management consultants help nonprofits better accomplish their missions by improving their managerial, operating, and economic performance. But to provide a brief overview of this field, like who is actually in the field of consulting to nonprofits, if we can call it a field, it's majority sole proprietors or 1 to 2 person firms, so people essentially working independently for themselves. The second largest segment I'm calling small firms. They have around 10 to 25 staff, small or boutique firms. They're often geographically concentrated, so they work in a particular metropolitan area, except for sector specialists. That might be a small firm that focuses on the arts but works nationally. And then the most visible providers in the field are a handful of 5 to 10 large firms, which are often derived from for-profit companies. So think names like Bridgespan, FSG, McKinsey and Company. And some of these large firms like Bridgespan and FSG focus specifically on nonprofit organizations, whereas others focus on nonprofits and corporations. And the field of consulting is really diverse, and consultants differ along many dimensions. So in terms of organizational form, some consulting firms are nonprofit organizations themselves, some are for-profits, some are kind of intermediary forms like B corporations. And in general, consulting firms have a reason for why they are incorporated one way or another. So for-profit organizations say they don't want to compete with their nonprofit clients for philanthropic resources. Nonprofits say they want to feel the same pressures that their clients feel. And B Corps are kind of trying to find a middle ground. Consulting firms also differ in the race and gender of their leadership and makeup. In my research, I found that consultants were predominantly white, and mid-size and larger firms specifically were often run by men, with lots of women working in senior leadership and also more kind of middle management positions. Sole proprietors, of course, were both men and women. Consultancies differ in their client mix. So most tend to work either specifically with philanthropy or with nonprofits, but there is usually a smattering of crossover in any given firm, and some firms have separate philanthropic and nonprofit practices. And for some, this is a distinction of principle, and for others, it's kind of out of convenience of their networks. And then some consulting firms, as I mentioned, specialize in a particular area of nonprofit activity, like arts organizations. Others are generalists, meaning they work with arts organizations, environmental nonprofits, health organizations, human services, kind of across the board. They also differ in their service mix. So all firms offer multiple services, things like fundraising, marketing, communications, strategy, capacity building, evaluation, facility planning. There's many different names for these things that they do. And then finally, consultants differ in their geographic scope. So many consulting firms like focus on their particular metropolitan area in which they're located. Usually that's out of convenience and the kind of limits of their networks. And generally, any particular metropolitan area will have a handful of consultants that are kind of their go-to. And this book specifically focuses on firms that do strategy consulting, which means they do strategic planning and other kinds of planning, like facility planning. So under this general heading of strategic planning, consultants conduct research in order to identify a set of goals based on their clients' strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats or challenges. That's a SWOT analysis. And this SWOT tradition, the SWOT kind of paradigm is part of a trend of results-based management that originated in the government, in the US government in the 1960s. And most strategic planning that we see in the sector today is linked to a model that was developed by the Harvard Business School that's specifically oriented around this SWOT analysis. So just to dive into strategic planning a tiny bit better, a tiny bit deeper. So this is a diagram that explains one of my research sites' strategic planning processes. And here the process has three logically related steps. So the first thing is that consultants conduct internal and external research around the organization's strengths and weaknesses. That's the SWOT analysis, leading to developing a vision, mission, and strategic issues for the organization. Consultants then develop strategies around services, finances, the services that the organization should undertake, and then the financial and organizational structure that's needed to support those services. And then they model and test these specific strategies to generate the final elements of the strategic plan. And in general, by studying strategic planning, I show that what looks like a rational process in which consultants conduct assessments in order to determine strategies and model results and then to determine the best solution is actually infused with assumptions and choices that have real consequences for consultants' results, for their clients, their client nonprofits, and for the broader nonprofit sector. So that's the kind of like departure for the book. So just to touch on my methods, I'm an ethnographer by training, and this was a mixed methods dissertation. So I studied both generalist firms and art specialist firms. I conducted 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork across 3 consulting firms. This was back in between 2017 and 2019. It's amazing how time flies. So I have 3 pseudonyms here that I use to talk about the consulting firms that where I conducted participant observation. Insight Solutions is a for-profit firm that's pretty typical in terms of its size, its services, its business model, its reputation. The generalist firm had about 12 staff at the time of the research and worked regionally. And then Focus Impact was another generalist, slightly larger at about 50 staff, worked nationally. And then Arts Now was an art specialist firm, had 15 staff at the time of the research and worked nationally. So in this participant observation, specifically at Insight Solutions, I did all the same work that any other junior consultant would do, but I wasn't compensated for my work, and everyone was aware that I was a researcher studying the consulting process. And then the other 2 field sites were really meant to put that primary field work in context, test assumptions, and further kind of elaborate the story that I was observing. And then to put this fieldwork in context, I conducted a total of 180 interviews with consultants, clients, and philanthropic funders. And when these interviews, what I was really trying to get at was representation across the spectrum of size and type of consulting firms. So sole proprietors to large firms, specialists to generalists. And just to touch on the theoretical tools that I leverage in the book. So I use 3 separate theoretical tools from sociology. First, I draw heavily on institutional theory. rooted in the idea that the pursuit of legitimacy drives uniformity or sameness across organizations, or structural similarity. And in this paradigm, consultants are thought to be carriers of legitimated ideas into organizations, and that they diffuse ideas across organizational fields. And just to apply that to the nonprofit sector, specifically in the nonprofit context, consultants are thought to be part of this movement towards the businessification of nonprofits, or the notion that nonprofits are becoming more like businesses writ large. And then to investigate how consultants actually build relationships with their clients and with each other, I draw on Viviana Zeller's relational work in economic sociology research program, which focuses on how people construct and maintain meaningful social relations via economic transactions. And then finally, to analyze how consulting work shapes nonprofits, I draw on work about standards and classification from science and technology studies, which shows that classification systems like spreadsheets and checklists are shaped by social context in ways that prioritize certain perspectives and exclude others. And I was really lucky at Princeton to be mentored by the amazing scholars that were behind some of this work, and that was a really exciting opportunity to combine some of these lenses in my work. So just to talk through at a high level the argument that I outline in the book. At a high level, I argue that most consultants to nonprofits, specifically those in small and medium-sized firms, often provide highly customized work and recommendations to their clients that reinforce the heterogeneity of the nonprofit sector and shed light on contemporary challenges facing nonprofits. But that's not the whole story. So just as they do so, consultants also re-embed and reproduce embedded power dynamics and hierarchies in the nonprofit sector via the assumptions that underpin their practices. So at a high level, even as consultants reinforce the unique characteristics that make nonprofits special, they concurrently impede nonprofits' abilities to overcome some of the most embedded and pernicious problems facing the sector. So I'll spend some time unpacking this general finding, and I'm going to start with the first point, consultants' drive to customize. So in their work, consultants use standard frameworks like Peter Drucker's theory of the business, which you can kind of see in the background here, a representation of that idea, as key tools in their work. And in the abstract, these tools promote focus and clarity in nonprofits. So to quote Marcy, the leader of a small consulting practice, she suggested that conceptual frameworks like this represent consultants' quote views of reality. In her words, most consultants come to the intervention with some level of mental model, ideas about how things should function or work. It's our view of reality. However, when they actually deploy these frameworks in meetings with clients, consultants customize their frameworks and create new ones to suit clients' unique needs and identities, or stated otherwise, to create a shared reality with clients, not just the one consultants bring into the work. And so what ends up happening is, while the frameworks that consultants use are meant to convey these uniform ideas about good nonprofits as highly focused and tightly coupled instruments of impact, where you do an activity in order to accomplish a certain outcome, in practice, consultants end up conveying heterogeneous messages to clients about good nonprofit practice. And they suggest at the same time that standard templates are not adequate to capture the complexity of nonprofit work. And then while consultants, excuse me, while consultants consistently introduce data into clients' decision-making, I found that they actually do weird things with data as well, or interesting things with data, I should say. So instead of prompting clients to make decisions directly based on consultant-gathered data, data-driven decision-making is kind of like the term of art there. Consultants use data to catalyze client conversation, and they also invite clients to question and push back on their findings based on clients' expertise about their own work. And so in doing so, they end up communicating, again, a more customized role for data in nonprofit work, one that's distinct from something we might call data-driven decision-making. And so why do we care about consultants customizing? I've done a lot of thinking about this piece. I call these practices, these kind of customizing impulses, empathetic customization. And in my view, tailoring consultant work to nonprofits' realities is really important in ensuring that nonprofits can actually implement the results of consultants' engagements. And it also makes consultants more likely to accurately represent the realities of organizations. And then and on the data side, using data to prompt conversation rather than make decisions kind of acknowledges the limitations of available data about nonprofit impact. I think as analysts working in this area, we all understand that oftentimes what we have at our fingertips is imperfect. And so consultants are kind of saying, like, if our data are imperfect, we shouldn't use them as the be all end all. Instead, we should use them to start a conversation where organizational leaders then get to decide. However, there are some downsides. So overemphasizing uniqueness can make it harder for organizations to learn from their peers. And when consultants are overly deferential to client perspectives, they can also miss opportunities to confront hard truths. So sometimes focusing too much on what makes you special or why your work is valuable can obscure these moments where folks really need to think about the rubber hitting the road. And so the other piece of this question is like, why are consultants so into customizing? And in the book, I show that consultants' impulse to customize often derives from their attempts to understand, identify with, and display sensitivity to their client nonprofit circumstances. And they do this because nonprofit serving consultants often work at the border between two sectors. So they have nonprofit sector backgrounds. So folks either come from public administration programs or from working in nonprofits themselves, but they work within for-profit firms. And so they do a lot of work to manage what I call this between field position. Namely, they use something that I call identity talk, and then they moralize money to work to maintain relationships that they feel are genuinely supportive and in solidarity with their nonprofit clients. So to talk about, to elaborate identity talk a little bit, a lot of consultants express themselves as nonprofit people or explain themselves as nonprofit people, and they distance themselves from the consulting industry. So for example, as one consultant told me, most of our people come from the nonprofit sector. Consulting is like a dirty word. So we're trying to say we aren't that. And this is responding to some negative perceptions in the nonprofit sector that consultants kind of rip off or take advantage of their clients. And generalist consultants also often avoid business and profit language in their work and instead focus on the caring and therapeutic nature of their consulting practice, framing consulting like as a type of care work, like therapy. And consultants' drive to customize is part of their efforts to maintain genuinely supportive relationships with their clients. So in addition to talking about themselves and their work in particular ways, they also make decisions within their practices to kind of like make good on that goal. This often entails providing clients with more work than they are compensated to perform, which causes overrun in the consulting organizations and what they call scope creep. Consultants also sometimes modify their fees to correspond with what they feel is reasonable for nonprofits. They have a general preference for what's called fixed fee billing. So that's opposed to like charging for the hour. Instead, they just charge a flat fee for a scope of work. And that's to avoid the perception that they charge clients for every moment that they work. They also often discount fees for certain clients and engage in pretty frequent pro bono work. So while these practices are very effective in conveying consultant solidarity with their clients and in reinforcing consultants' own mission-oriented identities, they can also have pretty serious repercussions for the consulting firms themselves. So frequent cost overruns and scope creep can cause profit problems within firms, and their consultants' deep commitment to their clients leads some consultants to de-emphasize their own internal operations and have a hard time prioritizing within their own work. So kind of paradoxically, all the work that they're doing to try to be in a genuine relationship with their clients can cause them to replicate some of the same problems within their own firms that they're trying to help their clients overcome. So now that hopefully I've convinced you that consultants really like customizing. I want to talk about the second part of the book, which focuses on the unintended consequences of consulting. So just as consultants work to understand and display sensitivity to their clients, they also reinforce some of the most durable stereotypes and power inequalities in the nonprofit sector through the assumptions that are embedded in their practices. So what are some of those elements? So through their research processes, the ways in which they gather information about their client nonprofits, consultants end up focusing their clients' attention on a few key variables: mission and vision, organizational structure and organizational networks, and strong leadership. And if you talk to consultants, these foci both stem from their own kind of principled beliefs around about how to accomplish good work, and also from the structure of their engagements and the nature of their research processes themselves, which make these elements especially visible. And within these foci, so mission and vision, organizational structure, networks, leadership, consultants' research processes often cause them to replicate status quo practices in the nonprofit sector. So in their research, consultants compare their clients to other peer organizations according to information that's publicly available online in order to identify best practices for organizations to emulate. And in doing so, they often inadvertently conflate best practices and as common practices. So this is a quote from an Arts Now consultant, which I think brings this to life. Quote, "How does what you've been doing compare to what other people do? When you look at this spider plot of how all the performing arts are doing it, and then you put what you think you want to do on that scatter plot, and it's all the way over here, and everyone else is over here, is it really the right decision?" So by conflating common practices and best practices and encouraging nonprofits to emulate their peers, I argue that consultants make nonprofits more like nonprofits by reinforcing common practices in the sector. And then as they work to build buy-in into their clients' plans by doing things, for example, like interviewing organizational stakeholders, consultants also consistently prioritize stakeholders with power over nonprofits. So, for example, funders, executive level staff, powerful partner organizations over the people over which nonprofits have power. So oftentimes communities or audiences and lower level staff. And they do this for two reasons. One, because powerful folks are generally more immediately accessible. It's easier to call somebody up, call a funder up and get their opinion than it is to do a community survey, for example. And these powerful folks feel more immediately consequential for the feasibility of nonprofits' plans. So whether or not you can get funding for an idea will immediately either open or close the door to being able to do it, whereas community perspectives are also important, but maybe a little farther down the line. In doing this, consultants reproduce a familiar power hierarchy in the nonprofit sector in which the opinions of funders and executives are prioritized over community voices. And then consultants also specifically reinforce funder power over nonprofits. So both consultants and their clients are often ultimately dependent on funders for survival because philanthropic organizations often are financing consultants working with nonprofits. So in this context, through their work, consultants end up serving as conduits of funder ideas into nonprofit plans. They do this a couple of different ways. First, they equate fundability with feasibility. They pay really close attention to how clients will pay for their plans and therefore guide clients to ideas that are attractive to funders. And then consultants also frame strategic plans as fundraising tools and position funders as a key audience for clients' plans. And through these practices kind of on a day-to-day level with their clients, consultants end up perpetuating funders' power over nonprofits. And then this last point is a little bit complicated. So hopefully I don't usually include this in talks about this work, so you'll have to tell me if it makes sense. Consultants also perpetuate a hierarchy of ideas in their work. So the field of consulting to nonprofits, as I kind of told you, there's like the sole proprietor, small firms, large firms. It's organized via a multifaceted hierarchy in which large, prominent firms are kind of seen as household names. And despite some critiques of these large firms as being inadequately attentive to the realities and specificities of nonprofit practice, they're considered by many consultants and by clients as higher status than small firms. This is often because like folks on boards of directors know or have worked with larger firms in their day jobs, and so they think highly of them. These large firms are more likely to use what I call hypothesis-driven processes, which involve proprietary tools, and then they end up coming with strong opinions regarding clients' best options. While small firms are more likely to focus on facilitating the perspectives of people in the room to produce an answer. And interestingly, in my research, I found that the former kind of hypothesis-driven approach is often considered to be somewhat masculine by consultants and clients, whereas the latter facilitative approach was perceived to be more feminine. And given the status hierarchy in which larger firms were seen as higher status than smaller firms, consultants and clients also preferred large firms, what I call unexpected advice, over smaller firms' collective wisdom. So even though there were critiques of large firms, kind of paradoxically, lots of clients wanted consultants to come back to them with a strong opinion about what they should do. And when instead a consulting firm came and said, you know, you guys are going to be the ones to answer your own questions, we're just going to help you come to that answer, they were very dissatisfied. And what's interesting is because of a kind of division of labor between consulting firms of different size in the field, in which larger firms tended to charge a lot more for their work than small firms. Think like $300,000 for a strategic plan versus $40,000. This hierarchy, this kind of like high status, low status hierarchy, ended up getting mapped onto the nonprofit sector itself. So large firms work with large nonprofits and are perceived to be superior to smaller organizations working with small firms. So that's how consultants perpetuate a hierarchy of ideas. So just to kind of wrap all of these things together, despite the prominence of high status large firms and the unexpected advice they provide, many consultants, especially those in smaller firms, in fact, work really differently. Stemming from their position between the four nonprofit sectors, their work is often customized to individual organizations' needs. However, consultants in the nonprofit sector also reproduce status quo ideas and reinforce some of the most durable power inequalities of the sector, for example, between nonprofits and funders. And they do this via the assumptions that are embedded in their processes rather than through the management ideas they distribute. They really are, in most cases, not trying to perpetuate these status quo ideas and inequalities. So just to say something about the implications of these findings and what they mean for the nonprofit sector, in my view, the idea that nonprofits are becoming more like businesses. This research kind of shows that that process is more complex than we think. So consultants did promote some general ideas and common language consistently across client nonprofits, but the strategic plans that they promote are just as full of clients' own opinions and interests and of existing practices in the nonprofit sector than they are of models from the corporate world. And so through their kind of countless little acts of customization, I argue and show that consultants reinforce the heterogeneity of the contemporary nonprofit sector and that they make nonprofits more like nonprofits, which acts against this kind of like perennial notion that nonprofits are businesses after all, and therefore should be judged by the same or similar standards and measurements. And importantly, and this last piece is a lot of fun to discuss with consultants, I show that consultants help their clients do their best work within the sector within the context of the sector as it currently exists. And this often means accepting and working with existing power dynamics and hierarchies. So because of this, consultants' tactics and recommendations often kind of act pragmatically and leave power hierarchies, like leave nasty stuff in place, essentially, rather than working to challenge or change these existing hierarchies, because their job at the end of the day is to help their clients be successful within the current circumstances. So that kind of leads to this issue of reinforcing the status quo. So just for a little plug, this is the book, came out from Stanford in November. If you're interested in reading more, you can get it on, all the major platforms. But with that, I want to close and ask for your questions and feedback. Even though this is a published book, I'm always interested in how it could improve and what resonates and doesn't. So I'm eager for your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah.
My
So
pleasure.
everyone, please type in some questions into the chat or raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you and have you be able to ask a question. That was fascinating, and I like it in part, as I was saying to Leah earlier, that I liked it in part because it's more general than arts and culture. It's about a broader nonprofit universe in which the arts and culture world is a part of it. And it'd be interesting to see how people see the more general things translate into the more particularized arts and culture experiences with these kinds of
Yeah.
things. So I'm curious to see what kind of questions people will have about that. I'll tell
Yeah.
you, my first reaction, so wait for other people to raise their hand and ask questions. My first reaction, here's the question that comes up to me, and it's about essentially what consultants are consulting about, the sort of scope of work. And you identify a lot of these things that they're talking about. But one thing I didn't really see is that consultants are consulting and advising about essentially the value proposition or the services that the nonprofit made, what their business is, what they're doing. It's a lot about how they're doing it, but not as much about what they're providing. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that. Maybe I'm imagining, which is fine. But what do you think of that?
Sure. Yeah, I want to say something about the arts versus generalist piece, and then I'll
Good.
answer that question. So one of the things that's really interesting is, generalist consultants also work with nonprofit or with arts organizations. And one of the really interesting contrast points in this research was the very different jumping off points and the different sets of assumptions that arts specialist consultants had versus generalist consultants working for the arts. So for example, like an art specialist would take as an assumption that things like museums are important and that they should exist. And they would usually compare their clients much more narrowly. For example, like other mid-size museums that didn't have a permanent collection and were located in rural places, as they would more tightly kind of define what the relevant peer organizations were, because they had these like operating assumptions that like museums are museums and they ought to exist. Whereas generalist consultants often ended up asking some of these more existential questions of their clients around like what is it that, why are you actually doing this, or like what is this meant to achieve in the broader nonprofit landscape? And they would often compare their arts clients to really different kinds of organizations that were trying to do similar things through their work. They were trying to reach communities in a particular way. They were trying to tell certain kinds of stories, but it might be, a museum compared to a park, or a museum compared to a health and human services organization. And so we can argue back and forth around like the different affordances or downsides of these two approaches, thinking more outside the box on one hand, perhaps, versus more accurately kind of representing organizations' particular challenges. But it was an interesting distinction. And to answer your question around like consultants and the content of what organizations do, I think a lot of organizations ended up reaching out to consultants because they were facing some sort of crisis of relevance. And, this is a familiar trope in the arts and culture. Something changed, right? Like the community that they were serving in a place-based way shifted. There was a lot of gentrification. The move of engagement online kind of rendered some of their in-person services no longer well attended. A major funder for their work disappeared. And so naturally, like those departure points were about what an organization was doing and whether or not it was still relevant. But I also found that this is part of this like using data as a conversation starter point. Consultants sometimes had a hard time bringing those hard truths to their clients about the like big relevance of what they're doing. Ultimately, like they're hired not to help organizations go out of business, but to sustain themselves, perhaps to reinvent themselves. But a lot of the places where I kind of saw consultants engage in what I call kind of rhetorical gymnastics, um, was around these like bigger questions of relevance, as opposed to like how can you become more relevant or how can you tweak what you're doing, but these larger existential questions of like, should you be working in this community anymore? Should you still be doing this kind of stuff? Those were harder conversations to have.
For sure. That's great. Well, I think this does tie it also one of the chat comments that Simon put in there about, I'll just read it. He says, how or did you find differences in how much consultants were reinforcing processes versus encouraging new pathways between the more art specialist consultants and the generalist consultants? And I think you've already touched on this a bit, but if you wanted to add more to it, that'd be great. And I would just say it is interesting to see that sort of reinforcing versus new pathways and a generalist versus specialist thing, in part because I think a lot of the customization and relationship building from the art specialist is builds in this reinforcement because I'm reifying your way of doing business and your worldview and all of this because I'm like you, I'm an arts nonprofit too, and all that.
Yeah, I think both kinds of consultants reinforce the status quo, but it was a different status quo. And it kind of depends on what your reference point is. So like all consultants that I studied were like really focused on organizational structure. And organizational structure kind of like across different subfields in the nonprofit sector is pretty consistent. Like your board ought to have functional board committees, and the committees ought to work in this particular way in order to like facilitate good management of the organization. That was pretty consistent across the board. I think that um, within these kind of more detailed questions around like how organizations engage with their communities, how they think about structuring the kind of like their programs or the content of their work, I do think that generalist consultants tended to give slightly more off the wall suggestions or suggestions that referenced practices that were common in other fields, but not in that particular subfield. And sometimes that landed well, and sometimes it made organizations feel that their consultants didn't understand their work. So it's kind of an interesting interplay in that way.
Cool. Okay, I got a question here from Catalina, and I'm sort of in my translational bit as I'm seeing this in a very public administration sort of make versus buy framework. And so the question is, do you think this work could be done within nonprofits themselves without actually hiring consultants out? Or is there any way consultants can continue to play an important role? And she's noting that it seems like staff at nonprofits are already stretched so thin and they don't have a lot of bandwidth or skill sets to facilitate a strategic planning process or a budget planning process and so on. So how do you think all this fits in with that sort of doing it in-house versus the essential value of the external contract for it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it really depends on the organization. Consultants were brought in, I should say, like, consultants were brought in to do this kind of strategic planning for a couple of different reasons. One, like, as I mentioned before, there's some sort of crisis that the organization is facing, either an existential crisis, either a financial crisis or some sort of a like PR problem or something like that. They oftentimes are brought in at the moment of leadership change, where like a new executive director is coming in and wants to kind of make their mark on the organization, take a step back. And sometimes they're also brought in to kind of like rubber stamp the ideas that put people in power already have. They need the kind of like external cloud of an external body to kind of come in and say like, yep, this is what you should do. So in that case, it would be harder for the work to happen in-house. Um, you know, uh, I've had an interesting experience. Sometimes consultants read or learn about this work and kind of suggest that I'm trying to say that consultants don't matter or aren't important. And that's not actually what this research shows. I believe, and I think this research shows that consultants are a really important thought partner to organizations in a lot of ways, and that there's very detailed kind of relational work that happens to help organizations see how they ought to shift or maintain their practice. But there are these kind of like unanticipated downsides that folks need to be aware of. Um, I do think oftentimes the decision to hire a consultant has to do with lack of capacity within an organization. That, like, even though consulting is expensive, it's less expensive than having a full-time staff person or like having an ongoing staff cost. And I think folks do experience it to be useful to have somebody who doesn't know about the organization kind of come in and bring a set of fresh eyes. So I think it kind of depends on the organization and the particular reasons that they are looking for consulting support and what questions they're trying to answer.
Excellent. Thanks, Leah. All right, I see a hand up from a Joanna Varan. Whatever, Joanna.
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Leah. This is really quite fascinating, especially given all of the all of the work I've done on cultural facility building and the role of consultants in that area. So I guess I wonder, I think a lot of what you spoke about today, and I haven't read the book, so I don't know if there's more information in the book, but a lot of what you spoke today about was sort of the functional nature of consultants, but then lending itself into the symbolic nature of consultants. And I kind of want to push a little bit more in that direction on the symbolic nature and about the network building effects that consultants serve. So, so much of professionalization of nonprofit organizations is about the people that they know and the networks that they're in. And I think thinking specifically about the arts and cultural sector, there are those big, 3 consulting firms that if you hire them to work on a strategic plan or a cultural plan or something like that, you're sort of in with the group, right? You know these people. So I guess it's just I wanted to hear your comments on that relationship or the function of networking and becoming more professionalized, and the engagement with consultants as a function of that.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. That's a great question. And, unsurprisingly, in my work, I found that networks are essential to every kind of facet of consultants' engagement with nonprofits. And what you specifically are mentioning about the kind of like symbolic power of association with these larger consulting firms is kind of part and parcel of this like interesting status power kind of hierarchy in the field, that even though organizations, nonprofit organizations generally were not very well served by large consulting firms, there was a separate kind of like status value of having a Bridgespan plan or a McKinsey consulting process or a Monitor Institute folks look at your work. And that was a kind of like status marker, helped unlock other resources, was kind of this like marker of legitimacy that in some ways stood in separate from or even parallel to the fact that a lot of folks felt that those organizations actually didn't do a good job of preparing workable recommendations because it wasn't actually about the recommendations that those organizations gave. So a lot of smaller consultants and smaller firms actually complained about these large firms and said, like, they gave us a bad name. People want to work with them because they have these other kind of like reputational benefits, but they actually don't know how to legitimately help organizations. So I think it kind of speaks to your point about the different reasons that people bring consultants into their work, what they're trying to get out of it, and the way that status and perception of the value of different kinds of information kind of like shapes these decisions as well as what people end up doing with consultant advice. And then I should also say, of course, like consultants' own networks were their business card, essentially. And the character and extent and power of those networks were a lot of the way in which consultants convinced organizations that it was valuable to work with them and also shaped the kinds of ideas that they had access to. And the differences in those networks was another big source of variation in the research. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that, it was part of so in the cultural facility space, it was sort of known that if you hired a consultant on to do a feasibility project, right, that feasibility project would probably come out, the outcomes would come out such that you should build the facility because then you're going to hire the consultant to work on the building project. So it's sort of all, this this loop, this connected loop of all of the people that are eventually getting to be in your sphere of influence. So
Yep,
great. Thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to that sort of doing the work in order to get to do the next contract and the next work. But I want to let Trevor have his hand up in the middle of all this. I think it's going to be relevant. Let him jump in. Go.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Leah. It was fantastic. I really thought this was interesting, and I'm interested in reading the book. Building off of Dr. Veronkovich's question and my own experience working as a practitioner in the public arts sector, do you have any insights as to the role of consultants specifically in managing public-private partnerships? In my own background, I worked for a city that was partnering with several different arts organizations, and we brought in a consultant to help navigate some of the maybe interorganizational tension there. And I'm curious if you have any insights to speak to on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, it's not something that the research focused on specifically, but I think consultants play a lot of different kind of intermediary roles in that sense. Like sometimes they serve as outsourced project management and in kind of managing interorganizational collaborations. Sometimes they are explicitly focused on kind of like managing relationships between people or streamlining the ways that systems connect to one another. And to return to the network piece that Joanna brought up, sometimes folks also hired consultants for their networks, right? Like they hire a particular consultant because they come from a career in city government and they know that they'll be able to call the city's managing director and get them to pick up the phone and answer some questions in a way that like another consultant might not be able to do. And so that kind of like network building or network access element is definitely part of, I would say it's often not a service that consultants actually advertise, but it's a huge part of their work kind of once you're a client, and a kind of subtext to what consultants value is to organizations.
Awesome. Thank you.
Carol.
Hi, thanks so much. Hi, Leah. It's great to see you.
Hi there.
I am curious. I'm sorry, I came a few minutes late, so I'm not sure if you talked about this already. As you know, in the arts, many consultants have had a big influence on the research agenda and on the just distribution of research findings. I'm curious if that is something that you found particularly influential in the arts. And also if you could just talk about, why consultants are doing that and what significance that has for their role in shaping the subsector.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I definitely, share that reflection about kind of the role of consultants. I will say this research didn't focus specifically on kind of like evaluation and research focused consultants. I was doing more strategy work or focusing more on folks that do strategy work, but there's a lot of crossover. And I actually started this project with the intention to focus on evaluation consulting and then kind of shifted over time. So I'll answer your question to the best of my ability. One of the things that was a kind of like pesky part of research about consulting is that consultants, as you say, like they do a lot of research as part of their work, whether it's like a portion of a strategic plan or a research study on its own, but they often used a really different definition of quality research than those of us in the social sciences use. And it was funny, like as I was talking with my dissertation advisors about emerging findings, they would be like aghast. They were like, "Oh my God, like it's an abomination." And as an analyst, I was kind of like, well, it's not my job to like say whether or not it's an abomination, but it ended up being an interesting kind of point that consultants and at least in the strategic planning space, use research primarily in order to kind of intervene in relationships and manage interpersonal dynamics rather than their number one goal being, excuse me, coughing.
She made it 55 minutes. This is fantastic.
I think I'm back. Rather than their number one goal being to kind of like accurately represent reality. That meant that they kind of formed conclusions in a way that was faster and really distinct from what folks who were trained in a different research tradition felt was adequate, and often meant that they kind of took some shortcuts to conclusions that got them to the next decision-making step or the next kind of like departure in the conversation, the strategic conversation that an organization had to have without necessarily like doing all of the interviews that they said they were going to do. So that is a big tension, I think, in the field, and also I think a tension between consultants who kind of consider themselves experts in different areas. So not exactly answering your question, Carol, but I hope it's interesting.
You are so gracious and tactful.
Thank you.
I think it is interesting, and just that is something that really came to mind as I was reading your book. The authority that is given, and I can't talk across subsectors, but certainly in the arts and culture, to consultants, as opposed to, you know, what seems legitimate in terms of particularly driving a research agenda, not a particular research finding, maybe, but
yeah, I agree. And well, there's one other thing I'll say that's not specific to the arts, but is kind of about the way that consultants kind of like mobilize research, which is, you know, this kind of like thought leadership, whatever that means, is a big part of how consultants contribute to the knowledge base in a field, but also market their services.
Right.
And so there's a pretty big, I think there's a kind of like conflict of interest in some ways, or conflation between these two goals in putting information out there. And I will never forget a moment in my fieldwork. I wasn't able to do ethnographic research in the large consulting firms because they wouldn't let me. I was like hammering away at them for years, trying to let me in. And the most I could get was one day in the offices of one of the larger consulting firms. I was sitting in a meeting and they were talking about authoring some sort of a research piece and a thought leadership piece on field building, on like the emergence of new fields. And I'm sitting there as a sociologist and I'm like, oh, there's a lot of sociological literature that could help you unpack that idea. I obviously didn't say anything, but that's not where their minds went. Instead, they said, let's review all of the cases that all the client cases that we've ever had that have anything to do with field building, and essentially use that to generate a hypothesis about how new fields emerge in the nonprofit sector. And that to me was just so telling about this kind of like self-referential way in which consulting organizations are kind of like referring to their own tools and strategies and assumptions in order to generate theories that they then put out into the world that influence kind of larger conversations around where the field is going. And that piece I do think is really problematic. So I hope that's useful.
Yeah, so interesting. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I love that self-referentiality. So
can I just say one thing? Sorry, I'm the co-host of the workshop, so I'm allowed to interrupt. I just wanted to say, you know, I really appreciate your work because of what Carol mentioned, which is you are very gracious, but you're very direct in your work. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very rare to see a piece of scholarship that is so directly, constructively critical. And I think the way that you present it is a very, very useful case for the nonprofit sector, and really could be beneficial. So I just wanted to point that out and say that I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I take that as very high praise and I really appreciate it. It's exactly what my hope would be.
Nailed it. It's good. So I want to get to this last question, and reading it made me think of a time when I worked at a shop that essentially was a consulting shop that had a bunch of money from a dominant foundation in the region that was essentially underwriting the overhead we had to go out to smaller nonprofits around the region and provide essentially below cost consulting work to shops that to nonprofits that could never afford a real consultant. So we got that subsidy from a foundation. And so the question that SB Strickland has put in here is about what you found in your studies about the relationship between the consultants and foundation funder direction, rather than just between the consultants and the clients and the nonprofits perspective. What can you say about this as our last sort of question, and then we'll let you in your throat get on.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question. A big part of the research was kind of thinking about these relationships in different directions. I think one of the kind of tricky pieces, as you mentioned, Doug, like oftentimes either directly or indirectly philanthropic foundation was funding or resourcing nonprofits to hire a consultant, and things would get really tricky in terms of like who consultants saw as the primary audience of the plan. So like, is it the funder, for which they might have totally different priorities, or the organization itself? And there were a lot of really, I think, tricky conversations in that sense where consultants were understandably trying to maintain their relationships and build relationships with philanthropic funders, but also do a good job serving their clients. So I think that was a place there where there was a lot of like really tricky interpersonal work. And I think some conflicts of interest also happened there. There was one case that I learned about as part of my research of where that can go really wrong, in which a funder kind of like hired a consulting firm on behalf of an organization to work for the organization. And that organization actually was not able to that consulting firm was not able to well serve the particular organization given their expertise, and it ended up being described even by the consulting firm as a kind of big waste of everybody's time. So I think like it has more to do with the structure of resource the structure of resource flows in the nonprofit sector, and the way that funders always are this kind of third party in the things that nonprofits do, rather than something like specific to the consulting relationship. It kind of is this like looming piece of the work, because it's always a looming piece in the work of nonprofits. So I hope that answers that question.
Great. Thank you, Leah. Let's all give a little Zoom set of applause for Leah for a great talk. We appreciate her giving her time to us and share with her the new book. Plug it again. The book's out there. Go look it up. Go get it.
Thank you.
I'll make my final plug, which is we'll be back here in 2 weeks for the next workshop, when we've got Stan Renard, Antonio Kyler, Matt Carruthers, and Jason and Bessie, who are going to be talking about our continuing bit about this other book on innovating institutions and inequities in the arts. And so we'll have a meeting on that 2 weeks from today. We hope to see you all there again.
Thank you all. I appreciate the conversation and the opportunity to share my work. Have a great one.
Thank you, Beck.